Ever wonder how a single spreadsheet lie can evaporate $60 billion overnight? Or how executives sleep after stealing retirement funds from thousands? Welcome to the boardroom's shadow realm. Corporate America portrays itself as a beacon of innovation and prosperity. But beneath the polished annual reports lurks a different reality. The suits we trust with our economy have repeatedly engineered financial catastrophes while walking away with golden parachutes. Meanwhile, ordinary people lose homes, savings, and futures. Enron's paper shredders ran over time. Wells Fargo created millions of fake accounts. In this video, we'll uncover the one most shocking business scandals that reshaped regulations, destroyed lives, and revealed the true cost of unchecked greed. The greatest heists in history weren't committed with guns, they were executed with PowerPoint. 1. In 2001, Enron executives created the ultimate corporate magic trick, making billions in debt disappear faster than a rabbit in a hat. The Houston-based energy giant constructed an elaborate shell game using special-purpose entities to hide massive losses while executives cashed out stock. When whistleblowers finally pulled back the curtain, the company collapsed spectacularly, vaporizing $74 billion in shareholder value overnight. CEO Jeffrey Skilling and Chairman Kenneth Lay claimed they were simply using aggressive accounting, like calling a bank robbery an unauthorized withdrawal strategy. The courts disagreed. Skilling got 24 years in prison, later reduced, while Lay conveniently died before sentencing. The Enron debacle forced Congress to pass Sarbanes-Oxley, fundamentally changing corporate governance rules. The company that once proudly called itself the smartest guys in the room proved only that hubris and fraud make terrible business partners. 2. WorldCom pulled off the corporate equivalent of claiming your pet goldfish, ate $11 billion. Between 1999 and 2002, the telecommunications giant systematically classified ordinary expenses as capital investments, instantly transforming massive losses into paper profits. CEO Bernard Ebbers, former milkman and motel operator who built WorldCom through aggressive acquisitions, insisted he knew nothing about the fraud happening directly under his nose. The court found this explanation about as believable as claiming you didn't notice someone parked an aircraft carrier in your driveway. Ebbers received a 25-year sentence, though he was released in 2019 on compassionate grounds shortly before his death. The WorldCom collapse destroyed investor confidence, contributed to a market crash, and triggered stricter regulatory scrutiny across all industries. Turns out, creative accounting is just fraud wearing a better suit. 3. Lehman Brothers, the 158-year-old investment bank, went from Wall Street titan to financial dust in September 2008 with $613 billion in debt. The collapse happened so fast that employees arrived at work to find boxes waiting for their personal effects. The bank had been playing a dangerous game called Repo 105, temporarily shifting billions off its books each quarter to create the illusion of reduced leverage. When the housing market imploded, this financial sleight of hand couldn't hide the truth any longer. Lehman's bankruptcy triggered a global financial panic that nearly collapsed the world economy. Remarkably, despite the catastrophic fallout, no Lehman executives ever faced criminal charges. The collapse forced sweeping reforms through the Dodd-Frank Act, but Wall Street's most spectacular failure remains a stark reminder that when financial institutions build houses of cards, ordinary people get crushed beneath the rubble. 4. Bernie Madoff operated the financial equivalent of a perpetual motion machine, a $65 billion investment fund that generated steady returns in all market conditions. For decades, the former NASDAQ chairman and respected Wall Street figure delivered consistent 10–12% annual returns that defied market logic. His secret? He wasn't investing anything. Madoff simply deposited new client money, used it to pay existing clients, and pocketed billions for himself. When the 2008 financial crisis triggered massive withdrawal requests, the mathematical impossibility of his scheme was finally exposed. The judge sentenced Madoff to 150 years in prison, calling his crimes extraordinarily evil. Madoff died behind bars in 2021, leaving thousands of victims, including charities, universities, and retirees, financially devastated. His massive fraud forced the SEC to completely overhaul its enforcement mechanisms and created the need for specific Madoff recovery legislation. 5. Volkswagen engineers spent years developing special software that could detect when a car was being emissions tested. Defeat devices, installed in 11 million diesel vehicles worldwide, would engage full emissions controls during tests, then switch them off during normal driving, allowing VW to market clean diesel cars that actually spewed up to 40 times the legal limit of nitrogen oxides. When researchers noticed the discrepancy, VW initially blamed technical issues before finally admitting the deliberate fraud in 2015. The scandal cost the company over $33 billion in fines and settlements, while several executives received prison sentences. More significantly, the Dieselgate scandal accelerated the global shift toward electric vehicles as automotive regulators worldwide lost trust in internal combustion claims. VW's attempt to cheat environmental regulations ended up forcing them to become leaders in the very electric revolution they had tried to avoid. 6. Wells Fargo employees opened millions of unauthorized accounts for customers between 2011 and 2015, all to meet impossible sales targets set by management. Branch employees faced relentless pressure to cross-sell products, with some wounded managers requiring staff to stay late until they reached daily quotas. The resulting fraud included creating fake email addresses, forging signatures, and transferring money between accounts without permission. When whistleblowers tried to report the widespread abuse, they were often fired. CEO John Stumpf initially blamed a few bad apples before investigators revealed the fraud involved over 5,000 employees, creating more than 3.5 million fraudulent accounts. The bank ultimately paid $3 billion in fines, fired thousands of workers, and Stumpf forfeited $70 million in compensation. The scandal forced the banking industry to reconsider aggressive sales incentives and highlighted the dangers of cultures that prioritize growth metrics over ethical conduct. 7. Elizabeth Holmes started Theranos at 19, promising to revolutionize blood testing with technology that could run hundreds of tests from a single drop of blood. By age 30, she was worth $4.5 billion on paper, had assembled a board including former secretaries of state, and secured partnerships with major pharmacy chains. There was just one tiny problem. Her miracle technology didn't actually work. Behind the carefully crafted image of black turtlenecks and a suspiciously deepened voice, Theranos was secretly running most tests on modified commercial machines, diluting blood samples in ways that produced wildly inaccurate results for actual patients. When whistleblowers finally exposed the fraud, investors lost hundreds of millions, and Holmes faced criminal charges. A jury convicted her of defrauding investors, though not patients, resulting in an 11-year prison sentence. The Theranos scandal forced Silicon Valley to confront its fake-it-till-you-make-it culture and led to stricter scrutiny of health technology startups. 8. Arthur Andersen, one of the big 5 accounting firms with 85,000 employees worldwide, destroyed itself over a paper shredding party. When federal investigators began looking into Enron's accounting practices in 2001, Andersen employees worked overtime destroying thousands of documents related to the energy company's audit. Firm partners invoked the company's document retention policy, corporate speak for quick destroy the evidence. The mass shredding continued even after the SEC formally requested records. When prosecutors charged the 89-year-old firm with obstruction of justice, Andersen claimed the destruction was routine housekeeping, not a deliberate cover-up. The jury and Supreme Court disagreed, though the conviction was later overturned on technical grounds. By then, the firm had surrendered its licenses and collapsed. Arthur Andersen's spectacular implosion fundamentally changed how accounting firms approach client relationships, making independence from audit clients a cornerstone of modern practice. 9. Tyco CEO Dennis Kozlowski didn't just steal from his company, he flaunted it with spectacular excess. Between 1999 and 2002, Kozlowski and CFO Mark Swartz looted $150 million from the industrial conglomerate through unauthorized bonuses, fraudulent stock sales, and lavish personal expenses disguised as business costs. The defining symbol of their greed, a $2 million birthday party for Kozlowski's wife in Sardinia, featuring an ice sculpture of Michelangelo's David urinating vodka and a birthday cake shaped like a woman's breasts. Prosecutors also highlighted the infamous 6,000 shower curtain and 15,000 umbrella stand Kozlowski purchased for his company-funded Manhattan apartment. The executives claimed the board had approved everything, but jurors disagreed, sending both men to prison for 8 to 25 years. The case exposed dangerous weaknesses in corporate governance and led directly to stricter board oversight requirements and limitations on executive compensation across all public companies. 10. HealthSouth CEO Richard Scrushy directed his finance team to fix the numbers, and quarterly results didn't meet Wall Street expectations. His solution to missing earnings targets wasn't improving operations, it was simply changing the numbers. Under Scrushy's direction, the rehabilitation hospital company inflated earnings by $2.7 billion over several years, systematically recording fake assets and fictional income. The fraud was so extensive that HealthSouth maintained 2 sets of financial records labeled as reported and actual. When 5 CFOs finally admitted to participating in the scheme, Scrushy adopted a bold defense strategy: complete ignorance. Despite overwhelming evidence, Scrushy was acquitted of all 36 counts related to the accounting fraud, though he later went to prison for an unrelated political bribery scheme. The case forced the healthcare industry to strengthen compliance oversight and led to stricter financial reporting requirements for public healthcare providers. 11. The Olympus accounting scandal began with a British CEO who lasted just 2 weeks in the job. Michael Woodford was hired to lead the Japanese camera and medical equipment maker in 2011, but was abruptly fired after questioning suspicious acquisitions and advisory fees. His termination triggered investigations revealing that Olympus had hidden $1.7 billion in investment losses over 13 years through an elaborate Tabashi scheme, using overpayments to shell companies to conceal massive financial holes. When confronted, company chairman Tsuyoshi Kikukawa initially claimed the payments were for goodwill, before eventually admitting to the massive cover-up. The scandal shocked Japan's corporate world, where such public exposures of wrongdoing were culturally taboo. Several executives received suspended prison sentences, while Olympus paid $646 million in fines and settlements. The case forced Japan to strengthen corporate governance requirements and highlighted the vulnerabilities of the country's traditional business culture that emphasized harmony over transparency. 12. Ramalinga Raju, chairman of Indian IT services company Satyam Computer Services, sent a remarkable resignation letter to his board in January 2009. In it, he confessed that the company's reported $1.1 billion in cash and bank balances simply didn't exist. It was like riding a tiger, Raju wrote, not knowing how to get off without being eaten. For years, Satyam had systematically inflated revenue, profits, and bank balances while creating thousands of fake invoices and employee records. When the fraud collapsed, investors lost over $2.2 billion. Raju and 9 other executives received prison sentences, while the company narrowly survived through government intervention and an emergency sale. The Indian Enron scandal forced the country to completely overhaul its corporate regulatory framework, creating stricter audit requirements and better investor protections. Most significantly, it catalyzed the creation of India's Serious Fraud Investigation Office and led to landmark reforms in the Companies Act of 2013. 13. German payment processor Wirecard went from tech darling to spectacular fraud in June 2020 when it admitted that $1.9 billion in cash, a quarter of its balance sheet, probably did not exist. For years, financial journalists and short sellers had questioned the company's explosive growth and opaque operations, only to face aggressive denials and accusations of market manipulation from Wirecard and German regulators. When EY auditors finally insisted on direct confirmation of bank balances, trustees in the Philippines revealed they had never held the missing billions. CEO Marcus Braun was arrested, while COO John Marsalek disappeared, reportedly fleeing to Belarus and then Russia with intelligence connections. The collapse exposed catastrophic failures by BaFin, Germany's financial regulator, which had actually banned short selling of Wirecard stock and investigated the journalists who questioned the company. The scandal forced a complete restructuring of German financial oversight, ending the country's reputation for regulatory excellence and demonstrating how national pride in a tech champion can blind regulators to obvious fraud. 14. In 2017, Equifax, one of the 3 major credit reporting agencies, announced that hackers had accessed the personal information of 147 million Americans, nearly half the U.S. population. Names, social security numbers, birth dates, addresses, and in some cases driver's license numbers were compromised in one of the largest data breaches in history. The most alarming aspect wasn't just the scale, but the company's response. Equifax waited 6 weeks to disclose the breach, while several executives sold nearly $2 million in company stock before the public announcement. When consumers rushed to freeze their credit, they encountered crashed websites, jammed phone lines, and confusing instructions. The breach highlighted a fundamental problem. Equifax collected and profited from consumer data without permission, yet consumers had no choice in the matter. The resulting $700 million settlement and congressional hearings forced credit agencies to offer free credit freezes and prompted the development of stronger data protection laws across multiple states. 15. Facebook's Cambridge Analytica scandal broke in 2018 when whistleblowers revealed that a political consulting firm had harvested personal data from up to 87 million users without their knowledge. The data collection began with a seemingly innocuous personality quiz app called This Is Your Digital Life, which not only collected information from users who installed it, but also from all their friends, a feature Facebook deliberately allowed in its API. Cambridge Analytica then used this data to build psychological profiles for targeted political advertising during the 2016 U.S. presidential election and Brexit campaign. When questioned by Congress, CEO Mark Zuckerberg offered a series of carefully scripted apologies while avoiding direct answers about Facebook's data sharing practices. The company ultimately paid a $5 billion FTC fine and faced investigations across multiple countries. The scandal fundamentally changed public perception of social media data practices and directly influenced the development of comprehensive privacy laws like Europe's GDPR and California's CCPA. 16. Boeing's 737 MAX crisis began with the race to compete with Airbus's fuel-efficient A320neo. Rather than design a new aircraft, Boeing modified its existing 737 with larger engines placed further forward on the wings, creating an inherent tendency to pitch upward during flight. To compensate, Boeing created the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, MCAS, which would automatically push the nose down if sensors detected a dangerous angle. The fatal flaw? Boeing didn't tell pilots about MCAS, provided minimal training, and designed the system to rely on a single sensor with no redundancy. When that sensor failed on Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, MCAS repeatedly forced the planes into nosedives that pilots couldn't override, killing 346 people. Boeing initially blamed pilot error before investigations revealed the company had pressured FAA regulators to minimize safety scrutiny to speed certification. The resulting $2.5 billion settlement and complete redesign of safety protocols fundamentally changed aviation regulation, ending the era of manufacturers essentially certifying their own aircraft. 17. Luckin Coffee exploded onto the Chinese market in 2017, growing from a single shop to over 4,500 locations in just 3 years, overtaking Starbucks as China's largest coffee chain. Wall Street was dazzled by the company's aggressive expansion and technological approach, with Luckin raising $645 million in its 2019 NASDAQ IPO. The secret to this miraculous growth? Much of it was fake. Its internal investigation revealed that senior executives had fabricated over $300 million in sales through fake transactions, creating phantom customers and non-existent purchases. The fraud collapsed in April 2020, when the company admitted the deception, sending its stock plummeting 75% in a single day. Luckin was delisted from NASDAQ, paid $180 million in SEC fines, and filed for bankruptcy protection. The scandal dealt a severe blow to Chinese companies seeking U.S. listings, leading to stricter audit requirements for foreign firms and raising fundamental questions about financial oversight across international boundaries. 18. Nikola Motor founder Trevor Milton had a remarkable talent for creating hype around his electric truck startup. The company's dramatic 2020 video showing its hydrogen-powered Nikola One truck cruising down a highway impressed investors until short seller Hindenburg Research revealed the truck had no functional powertrain and was simply rolling downhill. Similarly, Milton's claims about producing hydrogen at 1/4 the market cost, developing revolutionary battery technology, and having working prototypes turned out to be vastly exaggerated or completely fabricated. Despite these revelations, Nikola completed a $3.3 billion public listing through a SPAC merger, briefly reaching a market valuation higher than Ford, all without producing a single commercial vehicle. Milton was eventually convicted of securities fraud in 2022, while the company struggled to survive with a drastically reduced valuation. The Nicholas saga exemplified the dangers of the SPAC boom, prompting stricter SEC scrutiny of such transactions and forcing investors to more carefully examine pre-revenue companies making revolutionary claims. 19. Toshiba, the 140-year-old Japanese industrial conglomerate, spent 7 years systematically overstating profits by $1.2 billion through a practice known as challenge accounting. Executives set impossibly high profit targets, then pressured division managers to meet them by any means necessary. When divisions couldn't achieve these goals legitimately, they resorted to accounting manipulation, delaying the recording of expenses, prematurely recognizing revenue, and improperly valuing inventory. The fraud collapsed in 2015 when an independent investigation revealed the systematic deception, forcing the resignation of 3 consecutive CEOs and several top executives. The scandal rocked corporate Japan, coming just 4 years after the Olympus accounting fraud. Most significantly, it accelerated Japan's corporate governance reforms, leading to new requirements for independent directors and greater shareholder rights. The once proud electronics giant was forced to sell off key businesses, including its prized flash memory unit, fundamentally restructuring a company that had been a symbol of Japan's technological prowess. 20. Italian dairy giant Parmalat collapsed spectacularly in 2003 when it was discovered that the company had fabricated $14 billion in assets, including a completely fictional $3.9 billion Bank of America account in the Cayman Islands. Founder and CEO Callisto Tanzi had built Parmalat from a small pasteurization plant into a multinational corporation operating in 30 countries that had secretly diverted nearly $1 billion to fund failing family businesses and his personal lifestyle. The fraud was exposed when Parmalat couldn't repay a relatively modest $150 million bond, leading auditors to discover the massive financial hole. Tanzi was sentenced to 18 years in prison for market manipulation, while the bankruptcy devastated thousands of Italian investors who had purchased the company's bonds. The European Enron scandal forced Italy to completely restructure its financial regulatory system, creating a new unified authority with stronger powers and enhanced investor protections. The collapse still ranks as one of the largest corporate bankruptcies in European history. 21. The Bank of Credit and Commerce. International operated like a financial black hole where money entered but regulatory oversight disappeared. Founded in 1972, BCCI grew to operate in 78 countries while deliberately structuring itself to evade any single country's supervision. The bank became the preferred financial institution for drug cartels, terrorists, and dictators, offering specialized services in money laundering, tax evasion, and arms trafficking. When global regulators finally coordinated to shut it down in 1991, they discovered $13 billion missing and fraud on an industrial scale. Court-appointed auditors described BCCI as set up deliberately to avoid centralized regulatory review and to commit fraud on a global basis. The collapse left thousands of depositors stranded and exposed dangerous gaps in international banking oversight. The BCCI scandal directly led to the creation of new international banking standards, requiring consolidated supervision and forcing banks to maintain transparent organizational structures. Essentially, the world had to create new laws because one bank weaponized regulatory gaps. 22. The savings and loan crisis of the 1980s transformed America's boring neighborhood thrifts into casinos backed by taxpayer guarantees. When Congress deregulated these institutions in 1982, they suddenly gained new investment powers while retaining federal deposit insurance. The result was predictable. S&Ls placed massive bets on risky real estate and junk bonds, with executives knowing profits would be private while losses would be socialized. The poster child was Charles Keating's Lincoln Savings, which collapsed after executives looted it through self-dealing transactions while spending $1.3 million influencing 5 U.S. senators, the Keating Five, to pressure regulators to back off. By the time the crisis ended, more than 1,000 S&Ls had failed, costing taxpayers $124 billion. Debacle fundamentally reshaped financial regulation, creating the Office of Thrift Supervision and establishing strict capital requirements. Most importantly, it taught a generation of regulators that financial deregulation without proper safeguards creates a perfect environment for fraud. 23. Adelphia Communications transformed from a small-town cable provider to one of America's largest telecommunications companies under founder John Rigas. Behind this remarkable growth story, however, was a family using the public company as a personal ATM. The Rigas family secretly borrowed $2.3 billion through company co-signed loans without board approval, siphoned company funds to build a private golf course, and hid massive debts from investors through off-balance sheet entities. When questioned about one suspicious $13 million payment, CFO Timothy Rigas explained it was for the family's Christmas trees. The fraud collapsed in 2002 when a routine conference call question about debt guarantees caught executives off guard. John and Timothy Rigas received 15 and 20-year prison sentences respectively, while the company's bankruptcy wiped out $60 billion in market value. The scandal, coming alongside Enron and WorldCom, reinforced public perception of widespread corporate corruption and directly contributed to the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act's stricter governance requirements. 24. Qwest Communications CEO Joseph Nacchio turned America's fourth-largest telecommunications company into a case study in revenue fiction between 1999 and 2002. Facing impossible growth targets during the telecom bust, Nacchio orchestrated a scheme where Qwest swapped fiber optic capacity with other carriers at identical prices, then recorded these meaningless exchanges as revenue. When that wasn't enough, the company simply backdated contracts, recording future revenue in current quarters. Nacchio simultaneously praised the company's record growth while privately selling 52 million of his own shares before the stock collapsed. The SEC eventually charged that Qwest had fraudulently reported $3 billion in revenue, leading to Nacchio's conviction on 19 counts of insider trading. He served 4 years in federal prison, paid $63.6 million in fines and restitution, and was barred from serving as an officer of a public company. The Qwest fraud became a textbook example of how pressure to meet Wall Street expectations can transform accounting from measurement to manipulation. 25. Royal Ahold, the Dutch supermarket giant, spent years inflating earnings by $500 million through accounting fraud at its American subsidiaries. The U.S. food service division routinely fabricated vendor rebates and promotional allowances, creating fake confirmation letters and even setting up a special fax line where employees would impersonate suppliers, confirming non-existent deals. Meanwhile, Ahold executives falsely claimed they had control over joint ventures to consolidate their revenues. When the fraud was exposed in 2003, Ahold stock plunged 60% in a single day, wiping out $6 billion in market value. Several executives received prison sentences, while the company narrowly avoided bankruptcy through emergency refinancing. The scandal rocked European markets, forcing the Netherlands to strengthen its corporate governance code and prompting the EU to accelerate accounting harmonization efforts. Most significantly, the case highlighted the challenges of maintaining consistent controls across multinational operations, leading to enhanced international audit standards, focusing specifically on fraud detection in global companies. 26. Computer Associates CEO Sanjay Kumar elevated accounting fraud to performance art with the 35-day month scheme. Between 1999 and 2000, CA regularly kept its accounting books open weeks after quarters officially closed, allowing salespeople to backdate contracts to meet Wall Street expectations. Kumar personally intervened to finalize a $27 million contract in April 2000, then backdated it to December 1999, even having an employee break into the client's office at night to replace the signature page with a backdated version. Through such maneuvers, CA fraudulently reported $2.2 billion in premature revenue. When investigators closed in, Kumar orchestrated a cover-up, lying to prosecutors and destroying evidence. He received a 12-year prison sentence and $798 million in restitution penalties. The fraud forced a complete restructuring of CA's board and executive team, while regulators created enhanced guidance on revenue recognition. Most importantly, the case established that executives who obstruct justice during corporate fraud investigations face penalties as severe as the underlying fraud itself. 27. Freddie Mac, the government-sponsored mortgage giant, spent years engaging in what executives called FY smoothing, manipulating financial statements to create the illusion of steady earnings growth. Between 2000 and 2002, the company deliberately misstated earnings by $5 billion using complex derivatives transactions designed not for legitimate risk management, but purely for accounting manipulation. When rising interest rates would have created natural volatility in results, Freddie created elaborate transactions to shift profits between quarters. Executives called these accounting schemes by colorful names like Big River and Cougar. When the fraud was discovered, CEO Leland Brenzel and other top executives were forced to resign, while the company paid $125 million in fines. The scandal exposed deep flaws in the oversight of government-sponsored enterprises and directly contributed to the creation of a new federal regulator with expanded powers. This enhanced oversight would prove critically important just 5 years later, when both Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae required massive government bailouts during the financial year crisis. 28. Bristol-Myers. Squibb turned pharmaceutical distribution into financial deception through channel stuffing, the practice of shipping excessive inventory to wholesalers to artificially inflate sales. Between 1999 and 2001, the company dumped $1.5 billion of excess inventory onto distributors through incentives like pay later terms and promises to take back unsold products. This allowed Bristol-Myers to record immediate revenue while creating the illusion of growing demand for its medications. When the scheme collapsed, the company was forced to restate $2.5 billion in revenue and $900 million in profit. The SEC imposed a $150 million fine, while several executives faced criminal charges. Most significantly, the company operated for 2 years under a deferred prosecution agreement, requiring an independent monitor and complete restructuring of its accounting practices. The case established important precedents for revenue recognition in the pharmaceutical industry and contributed to the development of new accounting standards requiring companies to more accurately report true customer demand rather than temporary distributor stockpiling. 29. CMS Energy discovered the perfect way to boost trading volumes without actually trading anything: round-trip transactions. Between 2000 and 2002, the Michigan-based utility engaged in wash trades, simultaneously buying and selling identical amounts of electricity at identical prices with the same counterparty. These economically meaningless transactions had no business purpose other than inflating reported trading volumes and revenues. At the height of the scheme, these phantom trades represented 98% of CMS's electricity trading volume. When the fraud was exposed following the Enron collapse, CMS admitted to booking $4.4 billion in fraudulent revenues through thousands of wash trades. The company paid $200 million in fines and settlements, while its stock lost 60% of its value. The scandal, along with similar schemes at other energy companies, forced the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to completely restructure its oversight of energy markets. New regulations explicitly prohibited wash trading and required enhanced disclosure of trading activities, fundamentally changing how America's energy markets operate. 30. Peregrine Systems sold enterprise software and fabricated financial statements with equal creativity. Between 1999 and 2001, the company recorded $509 million in fraudulent revenue through channel stuffing, side agreements, and completely fictitious sales. When resellers wouldn't cooperate in the fraud, Peregrine created fake documents recording non-existent transactions with companies like Pyxis, an entity that literally didn't exist. CEO Stephen Gardner and his team maintained 2 sets of spreadsheets tracking real versus reported results, while executives cashed out $100 million in stock. When the fraud collapsed in 2002, Peregrine filed for bankruptcy, its $4 billion market value essentially wiped out overnight. The SEC eventually charged 18 former executives, with several receiving prison sentences. The company's auditor, Arthur Andersen, already collapsing from the Enron scandal, faced additional scrutiny for missing obvious fraud indicators. Peregrine's implosion, occurring alongside other major accounting scandals, added momentum for regulatory reform and directly influenced Sarbanes-Oxley's provisions requiring management certification of financial statements. 31. Quest Software executed the perfect backdating scheme until federal investigators noticed the statistical impossibility. Between 1999 and 2002, the company repeatedly granted stock options to executives on dates when Quest's stock price happened to be at its lowest point of the month or quarter. This remarkable luck allowed executives to purchase shares at artificially low prices, guaranteeing immediate profits. CEO Vinnie Smith received options dated just before major positive announcements sent the stock soaring. When confronted, executives claimed these perfect timing coincidences were just that, coincidences. Federal investigators disagreed, noting the mathematical impossibility of consistently picking market bottoms. The company eventually restated $143 million in earnings and paid $21 million to settle SEC charges. Smith returned $21 million in ill-gotten gains. The backdating scandal extended far beyond Quest, eventually implicating over 200 companies and forcing widespread governance reforms. New SEC rules now require detailed disclosure of option grants, effectively eliminating the practice that once quietly transferred millions from shareholders to executives through accounting manipulation. 32. Symbol Technologies earned the nickname the Enron of Long Island by turning inventory management into creative fiction. Between 1998 and 2002, the barcode manufacturer used a bewildering array of accounting tricks to inflate revenue and earnings. When quarterly results fell, Olympus Corporation, a Japanese camera giant, perpetrated an accounting fraud so elaborate it resembled financial origami. For over 2 decades, the company concealed $1.7 billion in investment losses through a scheme called Tobashi, moving toxic assets off balance sheets via payments to shell companies disguised as legitimate acquisition costs. Fraud unraveled in 2011 when new CEO Michael Woodford, the company's first non-Japanese leader, questioned wildly inflated payments for acquisitions, including $687 million for a company that made plastic containers for hospital waste. Woodford pressed for answers. The board fired him after just 2 weeks as CEO. This backfired spectacularly as Woodford went public with his concerns, triggering investigations across 3 continents. Multiple executives received suspended prison sentences, while Olympus paid $646 million in fines and settlements. The scandal forced Japan to confront weaknesses in its corporate governance system and directly led to the country's first corporate governance code in 2015. The case demonstrated how corporate cultures emphasizing harmony and conformity can enable decades of wrongdoing to remain unchallenged. 33. Satyam Computer Services founder Ramalinga Raju stunned the business world in 2009 with a confession letter beginning, "It is with deep regret and tremendous burden that I am carrying on my conscience that I would like to bring the following facts to your notice. The balance sheet carries inflated cash and bank balances of Rs 540 crore, $1.04 billion. For years, the Indian IT services giant had fabricated revenues, margins, and bank balances to appear more profitable than reality. Raju compared the deception to riding a tiger, not knowing how to get off without being eaten. The fraud wiped out $2.2 billion in shareholder value overnight. Raju received a 7-year prison sentence, while the Indian government orchestrated an emergency sale of the company to preserve jobs. The scandal, dubbed India's Enron, fundamentally transformed corporate governance in India, directly leading to the Companies Act of 2013, with its mandatory rotation of auditors, enhanced director independence requirements, and new whistleblower protections. The case highlighted how rapidly growing economies can outpace their regulatory infrastructure, creating environments where corporate fraud can flourish. 34. Stanford Financial Group promised investors the financial equivalent of perpetual motion machines, certificates of deposit paying impossibly high interest rates with no corresponding risk. From a luxurious headquarters in Houston, Texas, Chairman Alan Stanford built a $7 billion Ponzi scheme, marketed primarily to Latin American and Caribbean investors seeking safety. Behind the veneer of legitimacy, including cricket sponsorships and knighthood from Antigua, Stanford was simply using new investor funds to pay returns to existing clients while diverting billions for personal use. When regulators finally intervened in 2009, they found financial records created with the aid of Quick and Basic, and client funds had purchased Stanford personal items, including a private island and fleet of jets. Stanford received a 110-year prison sentence while clients recovered pennies on the dollar. The scandal exposed critical failures in international financial oversight, as Stanford deliberately operated between jurisdictional boundaries to avoid scrutiny. The case prompted significant reforms in cross-border enforcement cooperation and directly influenced how international bodies like IOSCO coordinate oversight of multinational financial operations. 35. Bausch plus Lomb transformed the noble practice of optometry into a shell game of shipping boxes nobody needed. In 1993, the eye care giant began pumping excessive inventory to distributors, particularly its own Hong Kong subsidiary, creating a mirage of robust sales while actual consumer demand remained flat. Company executives pressured sales teams to make the numbers by any means necessary, leading to warehouses stuffed with contact lenses nobody was actually buying. When regulators finally focused their gaze on the scheme, Bausch plus Lomb was forced to restate revenue by tens of millions and pay substantial fines. The scandal blackened the eye of the entire medical device industry and forced the SEC to develop new guidelines specifically targeting channel stuffing. The case established that shipping product merely to inflate quarterly numbers rather than to meet actual customer demand constitutes securities fraud, not clever business strategy. Perhaps most ironically, a company focused on improving vision had deliberately obscured its own financial reality. 36. Ascendant Corporation, formed through the 1997 merger of CUC International and HFS, discovered its new partner came with undisclosed baggage, systematic accounting fraud. Between 1995 and 1997, CUC executives had overstated revenues by $500 million while understating expenses across multiple business units. When the fraud was uncovered in April 1998, Ascendant stock lost $14 billion in market value in a single day, then the largest one-day loss in Wall Street history. The fraud was so pervasive that investigators discovered a special department existed solely to create fake journal entries each quarter. Former CUC chairman Walter Forbes received a 12-year prison sentence and was ordered to pay $275 billion in restitution. The Ascendant scandal directly contributed to the passage of Sarbanes-Oxley's internal control requirements and established the principle that acquiring companies must conduct much deeper due diligence on acquisition targets. Essentially, the business world learned that corporate marriages require more thorough background checks. 37. MicroStrategy's CEO Michael Saylor wanted to create the perfect growth story, even if it required fictional accounting. In 2000, the business intelligence software company admitted it had been booking revenue from multi-year contracts immediately, rather than spreading it over the contract's life as accounting rules required. And MicroStrategy restated 3 years of results, reducing revenue by $78 million. Its stock collapsed 62% in a single day. Saylor, who had frequently compared himself to Bill Gates, personally lost $6 billion in paper wealth. The SEC fined him $350,000 and required the return of ill-gotten profits. The timing was particularly embarrassing. The restatement came just days after Saylor had appeared on the cover of Fortune alongside the headline, "The Next Bill Gates." The case established important precedents for software revenue recognition and directly influenced new accounting standards regarding how companies record multi-year contract revenue. In a delicious twist of irony, a company that sold business intelligence software couldn't seem to apply basic intelligence to its own accounting. 38. Waste Management decided its garbage disposal business should extend to disposing of accounting standards. Between 1992 and 1997, the company systematically manipulated depreciation schedules for its garbage trucks and waste containers, extending their useful lives to reduce expenses while simultaneously underestimating the cost of future landfill cleanups. These manipulations inflated earnings by a staggering $1.7 billion, the largest restatement in history at that time. CEO Dean Buntrock and other executives settled SEC charges for $30.8 million, while their auditor Arthur Andersen paid $7 million for failing to identify the fraud. The scandal provided a preview of Arthur Andersen's more catastrophic failures with Enron just a few years later. Waste Management's accounting schemes led to significant reforms in how companies estimate depreciation and environmental liabilities, with regulators requiring much more rigorous documentation and periodic reassessment of key assumptions. The case proved that when it comes to accounting, you can't just bury your problems in a landfill and pretend they don't exist. 39. Informix Software transformed database management into database manipulation through a scheme that created revenues from thin air. Between 1994 and 1997, the company prematurely recognized revenue from contracts that hadn't been finalized, fabricated transactions with non-existent partners, and backdated contracts to meet quarterly targets. When customers weren't buying fast enough, Informix created parking arrangements where friendly companies would purchase software with secret agreements that they'd never actually have to pay. The fraud unraveled when a new CFO discovered hundreds of millions in phantom revenue. CEO Philip White received a 5-year prison term, while the company struggled to avoid bankruptcy through emergency financing. The Informix case directly influenced the development of Staff Accounting Bulletin 101, which established much stricter guidance on when software companies can recognize revenue. The scandal demonstrated how technology companies, with their complex contracts and intangible products, presented unique challenges for accounting oversight, challenges that regulators subsequently addressed through industry-specific rules. Livent's co-founder, Garth Drabinsky, orchestrated a financial performance worthy of Broadway, except the numbers were all fictional. Throughout the 1990s, the theatrical production company behind hits like Phantom of the Opera manipulated financial statements through techniques that would make creative accountants applaud. When shows performed poorly, Livent simply moved costs to different productions or capitalized them as assets. Executives maintained 2 sets of books, the accurate ones for management and the fictional ones for investors and auditors. The fraud collapsed in 1998 when new owners discovered the $500 million deception. Drabinsky fled to Canada, but was eventually convicted of fraud and forgery, receiving a 7-year prison sentence. The Livent scandal exposed the unique challenges of accounting for entertainment and creative enterprises, where subjective valuations and complex cost allocations create opportunities for manipulation. Regulators responded with enhanced guidelines specifically targeting entertainment industry accounting. In the ultimate ironic twist, Drabinsky's own story eventually became the subject of a documentary film, proving that in show business, even your fraud can become entertainment. 41. Conrad Black treated Hollinger International, a newspaper empire including the Chicago Sun-Times and the Daily Telegraph, as his personal piggy bank. In 2003, shareholders discovered Black and his associates had looted the company of at least $6.1 million through unauthorized non-compete payments that went directly into their pockets rather than to the company. When questioned about these payments, Black claimed they were thoroughly approved, despite evidence to the contrary. His downfall came when security cameras caught him removing 13 boxes of documents from corporate headquarters, despite a court order prohibiting such removal. Black was convicted of fraud and obstruction of justice, serving 42 months in prison before receiving a controversial pardon from President Trump in 2019. The Hollinger scandal fundamentally changed how boards handle related party transactions, with new rules requiring enhanced disclosure and independent director approval. The case demonstrated that even the most sophisticated corporate governance structures can be subverted when directors fail to exercise proper oversight. As one judge noted, the Hollinger board had been torpid, if not supine, in its duties. 42. Refco, America's largest independent commodities broker, demonstrated that going public works best when you don't hide hundreds of millions in debt. In 2005, just 2 months after its IPO raised $583 million, Refco disclosed that CEO Philip Bennett had concealed $430 million in bad debts through a complex scheme involving a hedge fund he secretly controlled. The revelation sent Refco into bankruptcy and Bennett to prison for 16 years. The fraud was remarkably simple. Every quarter end, Bennett would temporarily move the debt off Refco's books through circular transactions, creating the illusion of a stronger balance sheet for financial reporting purposes. The scheme went undiscovered despite extensive due diligence by underwriters and auditors during the IPO process. The Refco collapse led to significant reforms in how investment banks conduct pre-IPO due diligence, with enhanced focus on identifying circular transactions and related party relationships. Perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrated that even in the post-Enron era of heightened scrutiny, determined executives could still find ways to hide financial problems from the most sophisticated market participants. 43. American International Group, AIG, transformed insurance, business of managing risk, into a risk management catastrophe. In 2005, the insurance giant admitted to multiple accounting improprieties, including a transaction with General Ray that artificially boosted AIG's reserves by $500 million. The company had also systematically understated its connections with offshore entities and misstated investment values. When the dust settled, AIG restated earnings by $3.9 billion and paid $1.6 billion in fines. CEO Maurice Greenberg, once considered the world's most powerful insurance executive, was forced to resign. The scandal exposed how insurers could manipulate their financial appearance through reinsurance contracts designed not for actual risk transfer, but purely for accounting effect. Regulators responded with new rules specifically targeting finite reinsurance transactions, requiring companies to demonstrate genuine risk transfer for such arrangements to receive accounting treatment as insurance. The AIG case showed how even the most complex financial engineering ultimately collapses when it lacks economic substance. Just 3 years later, AIG would require a far larger government bailout for very different reasons. 44. Fannie Mae executives discovered the perfect formula for maximizing bonuses: manipulate earnings to hit targets that triggered massive payouts. Between 2004 and 2006, the government-sponsored mortgage giant deliberately smoothed earnings volatility, deferring gains in strong quarters and accelerating them in weak periods to create the appearance of steady growth. The Eli's manipulation overstated income by $6.3 billion, directly inflating executive compensation tied to earnings targets. When the fraud was discovered, CEO Franklin Raines and other top executives were forced out, with Raines required to return $24.7 million in compensation. The scandal exposed fundamental weaknesses in how Fannie Mae's regulator, the Office of Federal Housing Enterprise Oversight, supervised the mortgage giant. Congress responded by creating a new, more powerful regulator with enhanced authority to set capital requirements and limit executive compensation. These reforms came too late, however, as just a few years later, both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would require massive government bailouts during the 2008 financial crisis. The Fannie Mae case demonstrated how compensation systems directly tied to reported earnings create powerful incentives for accounting manipulation. 45. Computer associates took software revenue recognition to artistic heights by literally stopping the clock. Between 1998 and 2000, the company regularly kept its accounting period open after the quarter officially ended, a practice employees called the 35-day month. This allowed salespeople to backdate contracts to meet Wall Street expectations. And even that wasn't enough. Executives created entirely fictional contracts to fill revenue gaps. The fraud collapsed when whistleblowers revealed that even the CEO's administrative assistant was forging customer signatures on backdated contracts. Multiple executives received prison sentences, while the company paid $225 million in restitution to shareholders. Computer associates' fraud directly influenced the development of enhanced auditing standards, specifically targeting revenue cutoff testing, the procedures auditors use to ensure transactions are recorded in the proper period. The case demonstrated how easily conventional audit procedures could be circumvented by management willing to systematically backdate documents, leading to much more rigorous verification requirements. In a fitting epilogue, the company renamed itself CA to escape its tarnished reputation, proving that sometimes even a corporate identity needs witness protection. 46. Centennial Technologies proved that even small computer memory cards can hold massive accounting fraud. Between 1994 and 1996, a PC card manufacturer fabricated sales and inventory on a scale that would make fiction writers envious. CEO Emmanuel Pinez personally directed employees to create fake shipping documents for products that didn't exist, while the company recorded $40 million in entirely fictitious revenue. The deception included elaborate staging of inventory for auditor visits, with employees hastily moving the same boxes of product between warehouses to create the appearance of robust manufacturing operations. When the fraud collapsed, Pinez received a 5-year prison sentence while the company entered bankruptcy. The Centennial scandal directly contributed to new auditing standards, requiring more rigorous physical inventory observations and third-party confirmation of sales transactions. Most significantly, the case demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional audit procedures to determine management fraud. fraud, particularly in manufacturing companies where physical inventory verification presents unique challenges. In the end, Centennial proved that in accounting as in computing, garbage in, garbage out remains an inviolable principle. 47. Oxford Health Plans discovered the hard way that losing track of $400 million in medical claims isn't a viable business strategy. In 1997, the high-flying health insurer admitted its new computer system had failed catastrophically, leaving the company unable to track medical expenses or properly bill customers. This technological meltdown masked a deeper problem. Oxford had been systematically underpricing policies to fuel growth while inadequately reserving for future claims. When the true financial picture emerged, Oxford stock lost 80% of its value, wiping out $3.4 billion in market capitalization in a single day. The company narrowly avoided bankruptcy through emergency capital infusions from investors. The Oxford debacle transformed how regulators approach health insurance oversight, with new requirements for claims processing capabilities and actuarial certifications of premium adequacy. The case demonstrated how technology failures can conceal fundamental business model flaws until they reach catastrophic proportions. Oxford's near-death experience ultimately led to much stronger regulatory focus on health insurers' operational capabilities, a focus that would prove essential as healthcare costs continued their relentless rise in subsequent decades. 48. Safety Clean, America's largest hazardous waste manager, discovered that environmental cleanup is much easier than cleaning up accounting fraud. In 2000, the company filed for bankruptcy after revealing that executives had systematically manipulated earnings through improper revenue recognition and reserve adjustments. The accounting fraud masked a deeper environmental scandal. Safety Clean had allegedly been improperly disposing of toxic waste at multiple facilities, creating massive undisclosed liabilities. When the company's new CEO ordered an internal investigation, he uncovered not only accounting irregularities but also potential environmental crimes. Multiple executives faced SEC charges, while the company paid millions in environmental remediation costs. The Safety Clean scandal highlighted the unique challenges of accounting for environmental liabilities, especially when the company's entire business model revolves around managing such liabilities for others. Regulators responded with enhanced disclosure requirements specifically for environmental service companies, requiring much more detailed reporting of potential remediation obligations. The case demonstrated the dangerous intersection between accounting manipulation and environmental compliance failures, two problems that, when combined, can quickly become toxic for shareholders. 49. Xerox, the company that pioneered photocopying, applied similar duplication techniques to its revenue. Between 1997 and 2000, the document technology company accelerated revenue recognition on equipment leases, pulling forward profits from future periods to meet quarterly earnings targets. The scheme involved changing the allocation of lease payments between equipment, service, and financing components, shifting more value to upfront equipment recognition while reducing the portion allocated to ongoing services. This accounting legerdemain inflated earnings by $1.5 billion over 3 years. When the SEC uncovered the manipulation, Xerox paid a $10 million fine, and the largest ever imposed on a public company, and restated multiple years of results. The scandal directly influenced the development of new accounting standards, specifically addressing equipment leases and multiple element arrangements. Most significantly, it highlighted how even seemingly technical accounting policy changes can dramatically impact reported earnings, leading to much more rigorous auditor review of such changes. In a fitting twist, Xerox learned that while documents can be copied, accounting profits cannot, at least not without serious consequences. 50. Rentway executives discovered that when actual profits fall short, accounting manipulation can fill the gap, at least temporarily. Between 2000 and 2002, the rent-to-own retailer systematically falsified financial statements by manipulating inventory counts, delaying expense recognition, and creating fictitious vendor rebates. The fraud unraveled when a conscientious employee noticed suspicious journal entries and alerted the company's audit committee. Rentway immediately launched an investigation, which revealed accounting irregularities exceeding $127 million. The company's stock collapsed by 75%, and multiple executives faced securities fraud charges. What made the Rentway case unusual was management's prompt self-reporting of the fraud once discovered, a decision that significantly reduced the company's ultimate penalties. The scandal highlighted the vulnerability of retail businesses to accounting manipulation, particularly around inventory valuation and vendor allowances. Regulators responded with enhanced guidance specifically targeting targeting retail accounting practices. Perhaps most significantly, the case became a textbook example of how prompt self-disclosure and cooperation can mitigate the consequences of corporate wrongdoing, establishing a model that other companies would subsequently follow when confronting similar situations. 51. Just for Feet, a specialty athletic retailer, rebate frauded its way straight into bankruptcy court. Between 1998 and 1999, the company recorded millions in fictitious co-op advertising rebates from vendors like Nike and Reebok, claiming manufacturers had agreed to reimburse advertising costs when no such agreements existed. When auditors questioned these receivables, Just for Feet executives fabricated confirmation letters, with the CFO literally cutting and pasting manufacturer logos onto fake documents. The scheme collapsed when vendors received audit confirmation requests for rebates they'd never approved. The company filed for bankruptcy, while founder Harold Ruttenberg and other executives faced federal charges. The Just for Feet scandal fundamentally changed how auditors verify vendor allowances, with new requirements for direct confirmations and enhanced scrutiny of documentation. The case also highlighted the dangers of aggressive accounting in retail, an industry where thin margins create powerful incentives to manipulate financial results. As one prosecutor noted, Just for Feet had built a business model on fraud, proving that no amount of fancy footwear can outrun the consequences of financial deception. 52. Aurora Foods executives perfected the art of cookie jar accounting at a company that literally made cookies. Between 1998 and 2000, the specialty foods company behind Duncan Hines and Mrs. Butterworth's systematically manipulated reserves to smooth earnings fluctuations over multiple quarters. When actual results fell short, executives would release reserves created in better periods. When results exceeded expectations, they'd create new reserves to store excess profits for future use. This accounting pantry raid allowed Aurora to report artificial earnings stability while meeting Wall Street targets. The scheme collapsed when a new CEO discovered the manipulation, leading to earnings restatements, SEC charges against multiple executives, and eventually bankruptcy. The Aurora Foods scandal directly influenced the development of Staff Accounting Bulletin 99, which established clearer standards for evaluating the materiality of accounting manipulations. The case demonstrated how even seemingly technical reserve adjustments could constitute securities fraud when used to deliberately manage earnings. Perhaps most ironically, a company known for its baking products proved that when it comes to accounting, you can't have your cake and eat it too. 53. Rite Aid transformed ordinary drugstore accounting into extraordinary financial fiction. Between 1997 and 1999, the pharmacy chain overstated income by $1.6 billion through vendor rebate manipulation, improper expense capitalization, and reserve adjustments. CEO Martin Grass personally ordered backdating of documents to conceal the fraud from auditors. When investigators closed in, Grass attempted to obstruct justice by encouraging witnesses to lie and destroying evidence. He received an 8-year prison sentence, the longest ever for a CEO in an accounting fraud case at that time. The Rite Aid scandal highlighted the unique accounting challenges in pharmacy retail, where complex vendor relationships and inventory management create opportunities for manipulation. Regulators responded with enhanced guidance, specifically targeting pharmacy accounting practices. The case also established important precedents regarding obstruction of justice in corporate fraud investigations, demonstrating that cover-up attempts could result in penalties more severe than the underlying fraud itself. Rite Aid eventually survived through painful restructuring, proving that sometimes corporate rehabilitation is possible, even after the most severe financial violations. 54. Pharmacy fund management pioneered financial innovation by combining the worst elements of Ponzi schemes with affinity fraud. Between 1999 and 2002, PFM targeted pharmacists with promises of exceptional returns through investments in pharmaceutical receivables. In reality, the company was simply using new investor funds to pay returns to existing clients while diverting millions for the personal use of founder Robert Hessler. The scheme collapsed when investment inflows couldn't keep pace with promised returns, leaving more than 2,000 pharmacists with losses exceeding $200 million. Hessler received a 15-year prison sentence. The pharmacy fund management fraud exposed dangerous gaps in oversight of specialized investment funds targeting professional groups, leading to enhanced SEC scrutiny of such vehicles. The case demonstrated how fraudsters could exploit professionals' trust in fellow industry members, creating a false sense of security through shared professional identity. Perhaps most significantly, the scandal led pharmacy associations to develop financial literacy programs, specifically warning members about investment schemes targeting their profession. As one prosecutor noted, even highly educated professionals can become victims when fraudsters speak their professional language and exploit industry-specific knowledge. 55 Homestore.com turned the simple concept of a real estate website into a circular money scheme worthy of M.C. Escher. Between 2000 and 2001, at the height of the dot-com boom, the company inflated revenue through round-trip transactions where Homestore would pay vendors for services it didn't need, with the understanding that vendors would use the proceeds to purchase advertising on Homestore's website. These circular transactions allowed Homestore to record advertising revenue that was effectively paid for with its own money. When the fraud collapsed, the company restated over $192 million in revenue, more than 50% of its total reported sales during the period. Multiple executives received prison sentences. The Homestore scandal directly influenced the development of accounting standards, specifically addressing round-trip transactions, with new rules requiring companies to demonstrate legitimate business purpose for complex arrangements involving multiple parties. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of internet companies to revenue manipulation, given the intangible nature of digital services and the complexity of online advertising arrangements. As one judge noted, Homestore had created the illusion of revenue through mirrors rather than actual business growth. 56 ZZZZ Best started as a teenager's carpet cleaning business and ended as one of history's most audacious frauds. Between 1982 and 1987, founder Barry Minkow built what appeared to be a $200 million restoration empire while barely out of high school. The only problem, 90% of the company's claimed revenue came from non-existent insurance restoration contracts. Minkow maintained the fiction by creating elaborate fake work sites, renting vacant buildings and staging restoration work whenever auditors or investors visited. The fraud collapsed when a local reporter investigated customer complaints and discovered the company's largest projects didn't actually exist. Minkow received a 25-year prison sentence. The ZZZ Best scandal fundamentally changed how auditors verify major construction contracts, with new requirements for site visits and third-party confirmations. Perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrated that even young entrepreneurs with compelling personal stories deserve rigorous financial scrutiny. In a telling epilogue, Minkow later reinvented himself as a fraud investigator and pastor after prison, only to be convicted of securities fraud again in 2014, proving that some business models are harder to clean up than others. 57 McKesson HBOC demonstrated that even mergers can't hide accounting fraud forever. In 1999, just months after pharmaceutical distributor McKesson acquired healthcare software company HBOC, the combined company revealed that HBOC had been systematically inflating revenue through side agreements and backdated contracts. HBOC sales staff had routinely offered customers verbal assurances they could cancel contracts or delay payment while recording these conditional arrangements as completed sales. When the fraud was disclosed, McKesson HBOC's stock collapsed, wiping out $9 billion in market value in a single day. Multiple HBOC executives received prison sentences. The scandal fundamentally changed how acquiring companies conduct financial due diligence, with enhanced focus on contract terms and revenue recognition policies. Perhaps most significantly, the case established the principle that acquiring companies inherit not just the assets, but also the liabilities, including legal exposure, of their acquisition targets. McKesson eventually recovered through painful restructuring, but the HBOC acquisition became a cautionary tale in M&A circles about the dangers of inadequate pre-merger investigation. As one judge noted, McKesson had bought a company that looked profitable but was actually riddled with fraud. 58. Crazy Eddie, the electronics retailer famous for its insane prices, applied the same enthusiasm to accounting fraud. Throughout the 1980s, founder Eddie Antar and family members systematically skimmed cash from store registers before the company went public, then reversed course by artificially inflating inventory and sales to drive up the stock price. The family cashed out $74 million before the scheme collapsed. Among their creative techniques, employees would drive trucks full of inventory between stores just ahead of auditor visits to make the same merchandise appear in multiple location counts. When the fraud was discovered, Antar fled to Israel, was eventually extradited, convicted, and sentenced to 8 years in prison. The Crazy Eddie scandal directly influenced the development of enhanced audit procedures for retail inventory. with new requirements for surprise counts and systematic cross-checks between locations. The case demonstrated how family-controlled businesses present unique fraud risks, particularly during transitions from private to public ownership. In a fitting epilogue, the phrase, "His prices are insane," has become shorthand in accounting classrooms for businesses that seem too good to be true, because they usually are. 59. Regina Vacuum Cleaner Company sucked up investor money through an elaborate fraud that eventually pulled the plug on the entire business. Throughout the 1980s, CEO Donald Sheelan drove the vacuum manufacturer to report record profits through channel stuffing and fictional transactions. When distributors couldn't absorb more inventory, Regina created paper transactions with distributors that were actually just rented mailboxes. The company recorded the phantom sales while Sheelan cashed in stock options worth millions. The fraud collapsed when a new CFO discovered the deception, leading to bankruptcy, investor losses exceeding $100 million, and a 5-year prison sentence for Sheelan. The Regina scandal highlighted the particular vulnerability of manufacturing companies to inventory fraud, leading to enhanced audit procedures specifically targeting channel stuffing and distributor confirmations. The case also established important precedents regarding executive liability for financial misstatements, making it clear that CEOs could not hide behind delegation or ignorance when fraud occurred under their watch. In the end, Regina proved that while vacuum cleaners remove dirt, they can't clean up fraudulent financial statements. 60. ESM Government Securities created the perfect Ponzi scheme by targeting the most risk-averse clients, municipalities, and savings and loan institutions. Between 1977 and 1985, the government securities dealer operated what appeared to be a conservative investment operation, offering slightly above-market returns on seemingly safe government-backed securities. The reality was far different. ESM was using client funds to cover massive trading losses while falsifying financial statements with the help of a corrupt auditor. When the fraud collapsed in 1985, investigators discovered $300 million missing, triggering the failure of multiple financial institutions that had invested with ESM. The collapse of Ohio-based Home State Savings Bank following ESM's failure caused a statewide banking crisis requiring emergency intervention. The ESM scandal directly influenced the creation of new regulations governing government securities dealers, including mandatory registration with the SEC and enhanced capital requirements. Perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrated how fraud in seemingly obscure corners of the financial system could trigger systemic consequences, a lesson that would be relearned during the 2008 financial crisis. 61. Lincoln Savings and Loan transformed from a sleepy thrift into a high-flying investment vehicle with catastrophic consequences. In the 1980s, financier Charles Keating acquired Lincoln and immediately abandoned conservative lending practices in favor of high-risk investments in junk bonds and speculative real estate. When regulators raised concerns, Keating deployed his political connections, Keating 5 senators who pressured regulators to back off. The strategy worked temporarily, allowing Lincoln to continue its reckless growth until its 1989 collapse cost taxpayers $3.4 billion, then the largest bank failure in American history. Keating received a 12-year prison sentence for fraud and racketeering. The Lincoln S&L scandal directly influenced the passage of the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act of 1989, which completely restructured thrift regulation and created the Resolution Trust Corporation to clean up the broader S&L crisis. Perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrated the dangerous intersection of financial regulation and political influence, leading to significant reforms in how lawmakers interact with regulatory agencies. As one prosecutor noted, Lincoln wasn't just a business failure, it was a looting operation from the beginning. 62. Penn Central Railroad's 1970 bankruptcy derailed the nation's largest transportation company and nearly crashed the commercial paper market in the process. The collapse, then the largest corporate bankruptcy in U.S. history, revealed that executives had systematically concealed the railroad's deteriorating finances through accounting manipulations, including improper capitalization of expenses and misleading subsidiary transactions. Even as the company approached insolvency, Penn Central continued issuing commercial paper, short-term short-term corporate debt without disclosing its true financial condition. When the bankruptcy filing left $200 million in commercial paper essentially worthless, it triggered a crisis of confidence that required Federal Reserve intervention to prevent market collapse. The Penn Central disaster fundamentally transformed corporate disclosure requirements for commercial paper issuers, with new regulations requiring much more rigorous financial reporting. The case also established important precedents regarding director liability, with several Penn Central board members facing personal lawsuits for failing to adequately oversee management. Perhaps most significantly, the bankruptcy led to the creation of Conrail and Amtrak, forever changing how America's rail system operated. 63. Equity funding. Life insurance elevated fraud from art to industrial process by fabricating 64,000 completely fictional policyholders. Between 1964 and 1973, the company created an elaborate scheme to inflate its value by generating fake insurance policies, complete with falsified medical records and premium payments. These phantom policies were then sold to reinsurers, generating real cash for policies that didn't exist. The fraud required an entire department dedicated to creating and maintaining fictional customer files whenever auditors or reinsurers requested documentation. When a whistleblower exposed the scheme, investigators discovered that over 56% of equity funding's life insurance business simply didn't exist. Multiple executives received prison sentences for what was then the largest insurance fraud in history. The equity funding scandal directly influenced the development of new reinsurance regulations, requiring more rigorous verification of underlying policies. The case also established important precedents regarding auditor responsibilities for fraud detection, leading to significant enhancements in audit procedures for insurance companies. Perhaps most remarkably, the scandal was one of the first major financial frauds detected through computer analysis, when an analyst noticed statistical anomalies impossible in a legitimate insurance portfolio. 64. Four Seasons. Nursing centers turned elder care into a financial house of cards. In the late 1960s, the nursing home chain embarked on an aggressive expansion strategy, financed through a complex pyramid-like scheme. The company would use inflated appraisals to obtain excessive mortgage financing for new facilities, then use the proceeds to cover operating losses at existing locations rather than build the facilities as promised. When the fraud collapsed in 1970, investors lost over $200 million, equivalent to over $1.3 billion today, while many elderly residents faced displacement from facilities facing foreclosure. Founder Jack Clark received a 10-year prison sentence. The Four Seasons scandal directly influenced the development of new regulations governing healthcare facility financing, with enhanced requirements for appraisal independence and construction monitoring. Perhaps most significantly, the case highlighted the unique vulnerabilities of healthcare investments, where financial misconduct can have direct consequences for vulnerable populations. The collapse led multiple states to develop emergency response protocols for healthcare facility failures, protocols that continue to protect patients when nursing home operators face financial distress or regulatory action. 65. National student marketing sold corporate America on the power of the youth market and investors on fictional financial statements. In the late 1960s, the company became a Wall Street darling by acquiring dozens of businesses targeting the college demographic. Behind its meteoric growth, however, was systematic accounting fraud, including backdated transactions, fictitious revenue, and undisclosed contingent liabilities. The scheme collapsed in 1970 when concerned auditors issued a last-minute letter before a merger closing, warning that National Student Marketing's financial statements contained significant misstatements. Despite this warning, lawyers allowed the transaction to proceed, a decision that would have profound legal consequences. The SEC's subsequent enforcement action established the landmark principle that attorneys have affirmative obligations when they discover client fraud, fundamentally changing how lawyers approach securities transactions. Multiple executives received prison sentences, while the company's collapse wiped out over $400 million in market value. Beyond its impact on legal ethics, the National Student Marketing case demonstrated how conglomerate growth strategies could conceal underlying financial weakness, a lesson that would be repeatedly forgotten and relearned in subsequent merger waves. 66. Sterling Homex promised to revolutionize housing construction through factory-built modular homes. Instead, it revolutionized accounting fraud by recording revenue for modules that hadn't been built, shipped, or sold. Between 1969 and 1972, the company recognized income on bill and hold transactions where customers supposedly purchased modules that remained in Sterling's factories. In reality, many of these customers didn't exist, and real customers hadn't agreed to the arrangements. When the fraud collapsed, investors lost over $200 million in current dollars, while the bankruptcy left thousands of partially completed housing units abandoned across the country. Multiple executives received prison sentences. The Sterling Homex scandal directly influenced the development of Staff Accounting Bulletin 104, which established strict criteria for when companies can recognize revenue on bill and hold arrangements. Perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrated the particular vulnerability of manufacturing businesses to revenue recognition fraud, leading to enhanced audit procedures specifically targeting production verification and customer acceptance. As one judge noted, Sterling had sold the appearance of success rather than actual homes, leaving investors with nothing but empty promises. 67. Performance systems rewrote the rules of revenue recognition to disastrous effect. In 1971, the computer services company began recording immediate revenue on long-term service contracts that would take years to fulfill, essentially counting future earnings as current income. When auditors questioned this approach, executives produced documentation purporting to justify the aggressive accounting treatment. The deception unraveled when cash flow failed to match reported profits, forcing massive earnings restatements that wiped out shareholder value. The SEC investigation revealed that executives had deliberately manipulated contract terms specifically to achieve favorable accounting outcomes rather than for legitimate business purposes. The performance system scandal directly influenced the development of accounting standards governing long-term contract revenue recognition, with new rules requiring clearer evidence of progress toward completion before revenue could be recorded. The case demonstrated how seemingly technical accounting policy decisions could have profound impacts on reported financial results, leading to enhanced scrutiny of such policies by regulators and auditors. Perhaps most importantly, it established the principle that accounting should reflect economic reality rather than drive business decisions, a lesson that countless companies would subsequently ignore at their peril. 68. Bre-X Minerals pulled off history's greatest gold trick without a single ounce of actual gold. In 1997, this small Canadian mining company claimed to have discovered an Indonesian gold deposit so vast it would rewrite geological textbooks. Investors worldwide poured in $6 billion as Bre-X shares soared 280-fold. The company's geologist, Michael de Guzman, produced core samples glistening with gold flecks that independent labs verified. There was just one problem. De Guzman had been salting the samples by filing gold jewelry into dust and adding it to worthless rock. When independent verification was finally demanded, de Guzman mysteriously fell from a helicopter over the Indonesian jungle. Subsequent testing revealed not a speck of economically viable gold in the entire deposit. The Bre-X collapse led to fundamental reforms in mining industry disclosure requirements, with the Canadian Securities Administrators creating the National Instrument 43-101 standard specifically designed to prevent similar frauds. Upon reflection, perhaps the most remarkable aspect was how a handful of men with gold dust and audacity managed to fool the world's most sophisticated mining analysts. Fool's gold. 69. The salad oil scandal revealed that even the most liquid assets can be illusory. In 1963, commodities trader Anthony Tino DeAngelis discovered a devilishly simple fraud. Fill storage tanks partially with vegetable oil, top them with water, oil floats, and then claim the tanks were completely full when securing loans. Since inspectors only dipped measuring sticks from the top, they encountered oil and assumed the tanks were full. DeAngelis created a complex web of fake inventory receipts for non-existent oil worth $175 million, $1.5 billion today, using them as collateral for bank loans and futures trading. When the scheme collapsed, American Express lost $58 million, nearly bankrupting the company. The scandal forced fundamental reforms in commodities inspection and warehouse receipt verification, with new requirements for complete physical inventory verification rather than sample testing. It also led directly to Amex spinning off its warehousing business, permanently reshaping the company's structure. When analyzing the aftermath, one can't help but appreciate the irony. A scandal involving salad oil ultimately produced the regulatory dressing that still governs commodities markets today. 70. Billy Saul Estes built an agricultural empire on assets that existed only in his imagination. In 1962, this smooth-talking Texas businessman secured millions in loans against thousands of fertilizer tanks and cotton allotments that simply weren't there. When suspicious government inspectors asked to see these assets, Estes and his team would frantically move a handful of actual tanks between different farms overnight, creating the illusion of vast holdings. The scheme collapsed when one inspector noticed fresh tire tracks leading to recently placed tanks. Estes received a 15-year prison sentence, though his case achieved notoriety beyond typical fraud due to his political connections and mysterious deaths of potential witnesses. The scandal forced the Department of Agriculture to completely overhaul its oversight of farm subsidy programs, with new verification requirements designed specifically to catch phantom asset schemes. When considering Estes's legacy, it's worth noting that his fraud represented more than financial deception. It exposed the dangerous intersection of business and political influence in America's agricultural heartland, where a charismatic man could temporarily transform nothing into millions through sheer force of personality. 71. Ivar Kreuger, the Match King, built a global monopoly that ultimately burned investors worldwide. During the 1920s, this Swedish industrialist created an international match empire by offering high-interest loans to cash-strapped European governments in exchange for match monopolies. Kreuger's companies controlled 75% of global match production, making him one of the world's richest men. Investors flocked to his securities, attracted by reliable dividends that seemed impervious to economic cycles. Behind this success, however, Kreuger operated a complex Ponzi scheme, using new investments to pay dividends while fabricating assets through forged bonds and dual accounting systems. When the Depression limited his ability to raise new capital, the scheme collapsed. Kreuger committed suicide in Paris in 1932, leaving behind $250 million in fraudulent debts, $4.8 billion today. The Kreuger crash directly influenced the creation of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and modern accounting standards requiring independent audits. Looking back, what makes Kreuger truly remarkable was his understanding that financial complexity itself could become a smokescreen for fraud, a lesson that would be repeatedly forgotten and painfully relearned throughout financial history. 72. Samuel Insull built America's electrical grid and a financial house of cards that electrified Depression-era headlines. During the 1920s, this former Edison assistant created a pyramid of utility, holding companies that controlled electricity for much of the United States. Each company owned shares in others, creating a complex web that obscured the system's underlying financial weakness. Insull aggressively marketed stock to middle-class Americans, including his own workers, as safe investments with guaranteed returns. When the Depression hit, the pyramid collapsed spectacularly, wiping out $3 billion in shareholder value, $58 billion today. Insull fled to Europe, becoming America's most wanted financial fugitive before being extradited to face trial. Though ultimately acquitted on technicalities, his empire was destroyed. The Insull collapse directly influenced the passage of the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935, which forced the breakup of utility holding company structures, and the Securities Exchange Act, which created the SEC. When assessing Insull's legacy, the paradox remains that the man who literally brought light to America simultaneously cast thousands of investors into financial darkness through financial engineering too complex for its own time. 73. The Teapot Dome. Scandal brewed the perfect storm of government corruption in America's roaring 20s. In 1922, Interior Secretary Albert Fall secretly leased federal oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, to private companies without competitive bidding. In exchange, Fall received loans of approximately $400,000, $6.5 million today, from the oil executives. When Senate investigators discovered that Fall had suddenly paid off debts and substantially improved his ranch, they followed the money trail back to the oil leases. Fall was convicted of bribery in 1929, becoming the first cabinet member imprisoned for crimes committed in office, while the Supreme Court invalidated the fraudulent leases. The scandal fundamentally transformed oversight of federal resources, with new laws requiring competitive bidding, public hearings, and congressional approval for federal land leases. Examining this watershed moment in American political corruption, one can trace how this seemingly obscure Wyoming oil deal permanently altered the relationship between government and natural resources, establishing principles of public interest protection that remain central to federal land management a century later. 74. In 1869, financiers Jay Gould and James Fisk orchestrated history's most audacious market manipulation on what became known as Black Friday. These Wall Street operators attempted to corner the nation's gold market by buying massive quantities while bribing government officials to prevent federal gold sales that would lower prices. As gold prices skyrocketed 30% in days, businesses nationwide faced potential ruin since international trade required gold payments. Their scheme hinged on keeping President Grant ignorant of their manipulation. When Grant finally learned the truth, he ordered the Treasury to release $4 million in government gold, causing prices to collapse within minutes. Countless investors were ruined, while Gould and Fisk escaped financial damage by secretly selling their holdings before the crash. The gold panic triggered a broader market collapse and economic contraction lasting years. Congress subsequently established clearer rules governing Treasury gold sales, while the scandal permanently damaged the Grant administration. Analyzing this early market manipulation reveals how thoroughly it foreshadowed modern financial crises, demonstrating that even in capitalism's infancy, market corners and insider information could devastate an economy without appropriate regulatory guardrails. 75. Credit Mobilier executed America's first massive corporate fraud by essentially allowing railroad executives to pay themselves with government money. In the 1860s, Union Pacific Railroad directors created Credit Mobilier as a separate construction company, then awarded it contracts to build the Transcontinental Railroad at massively inflated prices. Since they controlled both companies, they were effectively paying themselves with government subsidies meant for railroad construction. When congressional investigations threatened, they distributed discounted company shares to key congressmen. The scheme collapsed in 1872 when the New York Sun exposed the distribution of shares to politicians, including future President James Garfield. Multiple congressmen were censured, while public outrage over the corruption contributed to the Republican Party losing control of the House for the first time in 18 years. The scandal fundamentally transformed railroad regulation, leading to enhanced oversight of government contractors and stricter conflict of interest rules for both corporate directors and congressmen. Viewing this through a historical lens, Credit Mobilier established the archetypal pattern for American corporate political scandal, revealing how easily public resources could be diverted into private pockets when oversight remained captured by those it was meant to monitor. 76. The South Sea bubble inflated from royal charter to national catastrophe in just 12 months. In 1720, the South Sea Company, granted a monopoly on South American trade, executed history's first major stock manipulation. Company directors spread false rumors about imminent trading profits while bribing government officials to support their enterprise. As share prices rose from $100 to nearly $1,000, company insiders secretly sold their holdings while continuing to promote the stock publicly. When the bubble finally burst, thousands of investors were ruined, including Isaac Newton, who famously lamented, "I can calculate the movement of the stars, but not the madness of men." The collapse triggered Britain's first major financial regulations through the Bubble Act, which restricted the formation of new companies without royal charter. Parliament also established new conflict of interest rules for its members after discovering widespread political involvement in the fraud. Looking at this seminal market collapse analytically, the South Sea bubble represents more than just financial folly. It demonstrates how thoroughly the fundamentals of financial fraud were established 3 centuries ago, with techniques that modern securities regulations still struggle to fully address today. 77. Tulip mania transformed ordinary flower bulbs into the world's first documented speculative bubble. Between 1634 and 1637, Dutch tulip prices reached astonishing heights, with rare bulbs trading for the equivalent of luxury houses. At the peak, a single Semper Augustus bulb sold for enough to feed a family for half a lifetime. This frenzy wasn't driven by tulip lovers, but by pure speculation, traders who never intended to plant the bulbs. The market operated through a primitive future system where bulbs were bought and sold on paper without changing hands. When the market suddenly collapsed in February 1637, countless Dutch merchants faced ruin from contracts they couldn't fulfill. The bubble's aftermath fundamentally reshaped Dutch commercial law, with courts declaring tulip contracts wagers rather than legitimate trade, effectively nullifying many agreements. When examining this early market mania, what remains most striking is how thoroughly it established the pattern for future bubbles: irrational exuberance, derivative trading, and the false belief that prices would rise indefinitely, essentially creating the template for financial folly that markets still follow 4 centuries later. 78. John Law transformed France from financial ruin to speculative frenzy and back again in just 2 years. In 1719, this Scottish mathematician convinced the debt-ridden French government to grant his Mississippi Company a trading monopoly over the Louisiana Territory, then half of North America. Law simultaneously established France's first central bank, which issued paper currency theoretically backed by Mississippi Company shares. As Law promoted exaggerated tales of Louisiana's riches, share prices rose from 500 to 10,000 livres within months. The scheme collapsed in 1720 when wealthy investors began demanding gold for their paper money, revealing there was precious little backing the currency. The ensuing bank run destroyed France's financial system, with Mississippi Company shares losing 97% of their value. The disaster was so traumatic that France rejected paper currency and central banking for decades afterward, significantly hindering its economic development compared to Britain. Analyzing this spectacular bubble reveals its profound historical significance. Law had essentially invented modern financial capitalism, combining central banking, paper currency, and equity markets into a system that was conceptually sound but catastrophically premature for its era. 79. The 1920s radio boom created the perfect broadcast frequency for securities fraud. As America fell in love with this revolutionary technology, stock promoters recognized an unprecedented opportunity to separate investors from their money. Companies with minimal assets but radio-related names saw their stocks soar based on nothing more than public excitement about broadcasting's future. The Radio Corporation of America, RCA, a legitimate industry leader, saw its stock rise 10,000% during the decade, creating a benchmark that fraudsters used to justify their own company's absurd valuations. Numerous radio Ponzi schemes emerged, with operators claiming revolutionary patents or exclusive broadcasting rights that didn't actually exist. These schemes typically collapsed when promised dividends failed to materialize, leaving thousands of small investors with worthless certificates. The radio stock frauds directly influenced the Securities Act of 1933, which established the registration and disclosure requirements that still govern securities offerings today. Reflecting on this technological bubble reveals striking parallels to later manias in electronics, computers, and internet stocks, demonstrating that while technology evolves rapidly, the fundamental nature of investment fraud remains remarkably consistent across technological revolutions. 80. Salomon Brothers transformed treasury bond auctions from government into a rigged casino game. In 1991, the prestigious investment bank was caught submitting false bids at treasury auctions, circumventing rules limiting any single firm to buying no more than 35% of any bond issue. By submitting bids under customer names without their knowledge, Salomon effectively cornered the market for certain treasury securities, allowing them to squeeze other traders who needed these specific bonds. When the scheme was discovered, the Federal Reserve temporarily banned Salomon from participating in treasury auctions, a potential death sentence for a bond trading firm. The scandal forced the resignation of CEO John Gutfreund and legendary trader Paul Moser. More significantly, it fundamentally transformed treasury auction rules with new verification requirements and electronic bidding systems specifically designed to prevent similar manipulations. Contemplating this watershed moment in financial regulation, what stands out is how thoroughly it exposed the vulnerability of even the most sacred financial markets to manipulation by insiders, revealing that without proper safeguards, even government bond markets could be corrupted by the very institutions entrusted with maintaining their integrity. 81. Michael Milken and Drexel Burnham Lambert transformed junk bonds from Wall Street backwater to the financial equivalent of nuclear power, capable of generating tremendous energy but potentially catastrophic when mishandled. Throughout the 1980s, Milken's high-yield bond department generated astronomical profits by financing corporate raiders and companies traditional banks wouldn't touch. Behind this revolutionary financing, however, lay systematic securities violations, including insider trading, market manipulation, and client fraud. Milken's network of corporate raiders and savings and loan executives exchanged insider information and participated in illegal parking of securities to manipulate markets. When the scheme collapsed in 1989, Milken received a 10-year prison sentence, later reduced, and paid $600 million in fines, while Drexel filed for bankruptcy. The scandal fundamentally transformed securities regulation, with new rules specifically targeting the types of manipulations Drexel had perfected. Contemplating Milken's complex Wozniak's legacy reveals the paradox at its core. While his junk bond innovations legitimately expanded capital access for growing companies, the illegal practices that accompanied them ultimately destroyed his firm and temporarily discredited an entire financial sector that would later become mainstream. 82. E.F. Hutton elevated check kiting from petty fraud to corporate strategy on an industrial scale. Between 1980 and 1982, the prestigious brokerage firm systematically manipulated the banking system's check clearing delays to obtain billions in interest-free loans. Branch managers would write checks between different bank accounts before sufficient funds were available, exploiting the float period to generate an average of $250 million in daily unauthorized credit. This wasn't the work of rogue employees. Internal memos explicitly instructed managers on how to maximize our use of float. When discovered, Hutton pleaded guilty to 2,000 counts of mail and wire fraud in 1985, paying $10 million in fines while suffering irreparable reputational damage. The scandal directly influenced the development of the Expedited Funds Availability Act, which standardized check clearing timeframes and criminalized intentional float manipulation. What makes this case particularly noteworthy upon reflection is how thoroughly it tarnished Hutton's once prestigious brand, captured in their famous slogan, "When E.F. Hutton talks, people listen." After the scandal, people indeed listened, but what they heard was the sound of a once great firm self-destructing through institutionalized fraud. 83. Prudential Securities perfected the art of selling sandcastles in limited partnership form. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, the brokerage giant aggressively marketed direct investments in real estate, oil and gas, and aircraft leasing partnerships to conservative investors seeking secure income. Behind the prestigious Prudential name, however, these investments featured astronomical fees, flawed economics, and misrepresentations so severe that internal memos referred to certain offerings as turkey partnerships. When real estate and energy markets declined, partnerships that had been sold as safe income vehicles collapsed, wiping out billions in investor savings. The scandal resulted in $4 billion in settlements, the largest securities fraud recovery in history at that time. Prudential's systematic misconduct transformed securities regulation with new suitability requirements and enhanced disclosure rules for limited partnerships. The SEC also established new standards for supervision of brokers, recognizing that the violations reflected systemic failures rather than individual misconduct. Upon analytical reflection, what made this fraud particularly devastating was how deliberately it targeted conservative investors, often retirees, who trusted the Prudential Rock logo as representing financial stability, only to discover their security had been built on regulatory sand. 84. Centennial Technologies elevated shipping fraud from occasional deception to corporate performance art. Beyond their accounting manipulation, the PC card manufacturer shipped anything but actual functioning products to inflate revenue numbers. When customers ordered computer memory cards, Centennial would sometimes ship boxes of bricks or defective products that would inevitably be returned, but only after the quarter closed, allowing the company to record revenue. Sales representatives were instructed to obtain signed delivery receipts without allowing customers to open boxes. CEO Emmanuel Pinez personally supervised shipping days, where employees would prepare hundreds of product boxes containing rocks, scrap parts, or nothing at all. When the fraud collapsed in 1997, investigators discovered warehouses of returned products that had been recorded as successful sales. The Centennial shipping fraud directly influenced the development of enhanced auditing standards, specifically targeting revenue verification with new requirements for testing product functionality and customer acceptance before revenue recognition. Considering this case through an analytical lens reveals how traditional audit procedures focused primarily on documentation review could be systematically circumvented by determined management willing to fabricate both documents and physical evidence. 85. Phantom Technologies lived up to its name by selling software that existed primarily in marketing material. Throughout the 1990s, this software company generated millions in revenue by marketing products with revolutionary capabilities in network security and database management. The reality fell considerably short. Customers received either nothing at all or basic software shells lacking the advertised functionality. When corporate clients complained, Phantom would promise that the missing features would appear in the next version, which which, mysteriously, never arrived. The scheme collapsed when several major clients simultaneously demanded refunds after independently discovering the software couldn't perform as promised. The company's founder faced federal fraud charges and received a 5-year prison sentence. The Phantom Technologies case directly influenced the development of new standards for software product claims, with industry associations establishing technical verification requirements for marketing statements. More significantly, it highlighted the unique challenges of software fraud, where the intangible nature of the product makes verification particularly difficult. Reflecting on this instructive case reveals how thoroughly it demonstrated the vulnerability of even sophisticated corporate purchasers to well-executed technical deception in rapidly evolving fields. 86. Miniscribe transformed ordinary bricks into computer hard drives through the magic of fraudulent accounting. In the late 1980s, the Colorado-based manufacturer faced intense competition in the computer hardware market and resorted to increasingly desperate measures to meet Wall Street expectations. Under pressure from CEO QT Wiles, who famously told managers to ship everything that moves, employees began packaging bricks and scrapped components as finished hard drives, shipping them to distributors at quarter end to record revenue. The company's executives even went so far as to break into their auditors' offices to switch inventory count tags. When the fraud collapsed in 1989, Miniscribe filed for bankruptcy, while multiple executives faced criminal charges. The scandal directly influenced the development of enhanced inventory verification procedures in the technology manufacturing sector, with new requirements for functional testing rather than mere physical observation. The case provided a stark example of how thoroughly traditional audit procedures could be circumvented by determined management fraud. Upon reflection, what makes the Miniscribe case particularly noteworthy is how perfectly it illustrated the dangers of executive pressure to make the numbers, demonstrating that given enough pressure, some managers will literally ship bricks rather than disappoint Wall Street. 87. United American Bank elevated family banking to an art form, specifically the art of financial fiction. In the early 1980s, Tennessee banker Jake Butcher built a regional banking empire while simultaneously running for governor and bringing the World's Fair to Knoxville. Behind this success story, however, UAB operated as a personal piggyback bank for the Butcher family, issuing massive loans to family-controlled entities through fraudulent documentation. Bank executives routinely created fake loan files, forged customer signatures, and manufactured collateral documentation. When federal regulators finally conducted a surprise examination in 1983, they discovered over $110 million in bad loans hidden through systematic document manipulation. UAB's collapse represented the third largest bank failure in U.S. history at that time. While Jake Butcher received a 20-year prison sentence, the scandal fundamentally transformed bank examination procedures with new requirements for surprise inspections and enhanced verification of loan documentation. The case demonstrated how even highly regulated banks could conceal massive fraud through document manipulation when examinations became routine and predictable. Analyzing this watershed banking failure reveals how thoroughly it exposed the vulnerability of the banking system to insider abuse, prompting regulatory reforms that continue to shape bank supervision 4 decades later. 88. Penn Square Bank transformed a tiny Oklahoma shopping center bank into the epicenter of a national financial crisis. In the early 1980s, this small Oklahoma City bank rode the oil boom by originating energy loans with almost no underwriting standards, then selling them to major banks nationwide. Loan officers like the flamboyant Bill Patterson, famous for wearing Mickey Mouse ears while closing deals, approved billions in loans based on wildly optimistic oil price projections. When energy prices collapsed, the bank failed in 1982, but the crisis was just beginning. Penn Square had sold participations in its questionable loans to major institutions, including Continental Illinois and Seattle First National, spreading the contagion throughout the banking system. Continental Illinois later failed in what was then the largest bank collapse in American history, requiring a federal bailout that established the too big to fail doctrine. The Penn Square disaster fundamentally transformed bank regulation, with new standards for loan participations requiring independent underwriting rather than reliance on the originating bank's analysis. Reflecting on this pivotal banking crisis reveals how thoroughly it demonstrated the dangers of regulatory silos, where risky loans could be originated in a small institution but create systemic risk when distributed throughout the banking system. 89. Franklin National Bank discovered that foreign exchange trading could generate exciting profits, right until it caused the largest bank failure in American history. In the early 1970s, this once conservative Long Island institution transformed itself through aggressive international expansion and speculative currency trading. Under the control of Italian financier Michele Sindona, later revealed to have mafia connections, Franklin National began taking massive unhedged positions in foreign currencies, while simultaneously cooking its books to hide mounting losses. When the fraud was discovered in May 1974, the Federal Reserve provided emergency liquidity while regulators arranged a sale of viable operations to European American Bank. Franklin's collapse, then the largest bank failure in U.S. history at $1.7 billion, revealed dangerous gaps in the oversight of international banking operations. The scandal directly influenced the creation of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, which established the first international standards for bank capital and foreign exchange risk management. Examining this pivotal banking failure analytically reveals its profound significance in financial history. It demonstrated that in an increasingly globalized financial system, banks could use international operations to escape effective regulatory oversight, necessitating unprecedented international coordination among bank supervisors. United States National Bank of San Diego demonstrated how one man could transform a conservative institution into his personal piggy bank. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, controlling shareholder C. Arnholt Smith, once named Mr. San Diego for his civic contributions, used the bank to fund his other business ventures through loans to associates and shell companies. When these entities couldn't repay, Smith simply ordered more loans to cover the payments on existing loans, creating a massive pyramid scheme within a federally insured bank. By 1973, Smith had directed over $400 million, nearly 80% of the bank's loan portfolio, to companies he secretly controlled. When regulators finally intervened, USNB's collapse represented the largest bank failure since the Great Depression. Smith received a prison sentence while U.S. taxpayers absorbed losses exceeding $140 million. The scandal fundamentally transformed bank regulation, with new requirements for disclosure of insider transactions and enhanced monitoring of loan concentrations. Reflecting on this instructive banking collapse reveals its lasting significance. It demonstrated the vulnerability of supposedly regulated institutions to determined insider abuse, directly influencing the development of modern bank supervision frameworks that remain in place today. 91. The Sharpstown scandal transformed Texas politics through a perfect storm of banking fraud and political corruption. In 1971, Houston banker and developer Frank Sharp orchestrated a stock manipulation scheme involving National Bankers Life Insurance Company. Sharp arranged secret loans to prominent Texas politicians, including the governor, attorney general, and key legislators, allowing them to purchase NBL stock with essentially no money down. Sharp then artificially inflated the stock price through manipulated trading, allowing his political associates to sell at a substantial profit before the collapse. When the fraud was exposed, multiple officials faced federal charges, while dozens more were implicated. The 1972 Texas elections saw unprecedented turnover, with voters removing most incumbents tainted by the scandal. The Sharpstown affair fundamentally transformed Texas government, leading to landmark transparency legislation, including open records laws, financial disclosure requirements for officials, and open meetings rules that continue to govern the state today. Analyzing this watershed moment in political corruption reveals its lasting significance. It demonstrated how thoroughly financial fraud and political corruption could become intertwined, permanently reshaping public expectations for governmental transparency in America's second-largest state. 92. Westech Corporation transformed government contracts into private profit centers through systematic fraud that ultimately threatened national security. Throughout the 1980s, this defense contractor specialized in providing electronic systems for military applications, including equipment for nuclear submarines and missile systems. Behind this patriotic facade, Westech executives deliberately overcharged the Department of Defense through various schemes, including cross-charging between contracts, billing for phantom labor hours, and substituting substandard components while charging for military-grade materials. The fraud was so brazen that internal documents referred to certain accounts as cash cows that could be milked indefinitely. When a whistleblower alerted authorities, investigators discovered millions in fraudulent charges spanning dozens of critical defense projects. Multiple executives received prison sentences while the company paid substantial penalties. The West-Ek case fundamentally transformed defense procurement with new requirements for certification of cost data and enhanced penalties for fraud involving national security systems. Considered through an analytical lens, what makes this case particularly significant was how thoroughly it exposed the vulnerability of defense procurement to systematic abuse, demonstrating that without proper oversight, even the most sensitive military programs would be compromised by corporate greed. 93. General Dynamics transformed submarine construction into a masterclass in government contract manipulation. In the mid-1980s, the defense contractor was building the Navy's new SSN-6888 Los Angeles-class nuclear attack submarines under contracts worth billions. When cost overruns threatened profits, company executives systematically shifted expenses between contracts, delayed reporting cost increases, and manipulated progress payments to maintain cash flow while concealing performance problems. Most egregiously, the company billed the government for personal expenses of executives, including country club memberships and personal travel labeled as business development. Whistleblowers alerted authorities. Investigations revealed over $240 million in questionable charges. Scandal forced the resignation of several executives in a corporate settlement exceeding $100 million. Most significantly, the General Dynamics case directly influenced the passage of enhanced procurement regulations and the creation of specialized audit teams focused exclusively on defense contract supervision. Reflecting on this pivotal procurement scandal reveals its lasting significance. It demonstrated the inherent challenges of monitoring complex defense projects, where technical complexity and national security classification can become convenient shields for financial misconduct, prompting reforms that continue to shape defense contracting today. 94. Litton Industries turned Navy shipbuilding contracts into an ocean of red ink for taxpayers. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, the conglomerate's Ingalls Shipbuilding Division systematically manipulated cost estimates and progress reports on destroyer and cruiser contracts. Using a buy-in strategy, Litton would deliberately underbid competitors with unrealistic cost projections, secure the contract, then claim unforeseen circumstances requiring massive price adjustments. When the Navy resisted these increases, Litton would slow construction while filing claims alleging government-caused delays. This strategy culminated in a $1.2 billion claim against the Navy, then the largest contract claim in Pentagon history. Investigations revealed internal documents showing executives had planned this approach from the beginning, viewing initial contract prices merely as down payments on the real costs. The scandal forced fundamental reforms in naval procurement, with new contract structures specifically designed to prevent similar manipulations. The Litton case demonstrated how thoroughly defense contractors could exploit the complexity of major weapon systems to extract additional payments, leading to the development of modern earned value management systems and independent cost estimation requirements that continue to govern major defense acquisitions today. 95. McDonnell Douglas calculated that fixing the DC-10's cargo door would cost $5.6 million, while settling lawsuits from a catastrophic failure might cost $5.5 million. They chose the cheaper option. In the early 1970s, engineers identified a serious design flaw in the DC-10's cargo door locking mechanism that could cause explosive decompression if the door failed during flight. Rather than implement a comprehensive fix, the company opted for a partial solution while concealing the known risk from regulators and airlines. This decision proved catastrophic in 1974 when a Turkish Airlines DC-10 crashed near Paris after its cargo door failed at altitude, killing all 346 people aboard. Subsequent investigations revealed that McDonnell Douglas had deliberately downplayed the danger in communications. With the FAA, the scandal fundamentally transformed aircraft certification, with new requirements for failure analysis and third-party verification of manufacturers' safety claims. Most significantly, it led to the creation of the Special Certification Review process, allowing independent assessment of aircraft systems when safety concerns emerge. Examining this tragic case reveals its profound significance in aviation safety history. It demonstrated the potentially catastrophic consequences when manufacturers make safety decisions based primarily on financial calculations rather than passenger protection. 96. Robbins transformed the Dalkon Shield from medical breakthrough to public health disaster through corporate denial. In the early 1970s, this pharmaceutical company aggressively marketed its intrauterine device as safer than competitors, despite internal tests showing the shield's unique tail string could wick bacteria into the normally sterile uterus. When women began suffering pelvic infections, sepsis, and even death, Robbins responded by blaming patients' hygiene and sexual behavior while pressuring researchers to alter unfavorable findings. The company continued international sales even after suspending U.S. distribution, particularly targeting developing countries with limited regulatory oversight. By the time Robbins filed for bankruptcy in 1985, facing 195,000 injury claims, the Dalkon Shield had caused at least 20 deaths and thousands of cases of infertility. The scandal fundamentally transformed pharmaceutical regulation, with new requirements for pre-market medical device testing and post-market surveillance systems that continue to protect patients today. Contemplating this landmark corporate cover-up reveals its lasting significance. It demonstrated the catastrophic human consequences when corporations prioritize market share over transparent disclosure of safety risks, directly influencing both regulatory frameworks and judicial approaches to corporate liability for dangerous products. 97. Johns Manville executives knew asbestos was killing their workers, but calculated that silence would be more profitable than safety. For decades, the company concealed scientific evidence linking asbestos exposure to deadly lung diseases, even as its own medical directors documented alarming illness rates among employees. Internal memos revealed the company's strategy: the less said about asbestos and disease, the better off we are. When workers developed symptoms, company doctors diagnosed bilateral pneumonia rather than asbestos-related conditions. The corporation withheld X-rays showing lung damage and edited scientific articles to downplay risks. This concealment continued until overwhelming evidence and lawsuits forced the truth into public view. Manville ultimately filed for bankruptcy in 1982, facing 16,500 lawsuits. The scandal fundamentally transformed both occupational safety regulation and corporate liability law, establishing that companies concealing health hazards could face punitive damages and personal liability for executives. The resulting Manville Trust, still operating today, created a new model for compensating victims of industrial disease. Looking at this landmark corporate cover-up analytically reveals how thoroughly it reshaped American law, establishing the principle that corporations have affirmative duties to disclose known health risks regardless of short-term financial impact. 98. Ford Motor Company determined that it was cheaper to pay for burn victims than fix the Pinto's fuel tank. In the early 1970s, Ford engineers discovered that rear-end collisions could cause the compact car's fuel tank to rupture and ignite, potentially causing fatal fires. Internal documents revealed that executives conducted a cost-benefit analysis, comparing the $11 per vehicle required to strengthen the tank against the projected costs of settlements with burn victims, which they calculated at $200,000 per life lost. Based on this analysis, Ford decided against modifying the design. When this value of life calculation became public during subsequent litigation, it caused national outrage and led to the recall of 1.5 million vehicles. While Ford was ultimately acquitted of criminal charges in a landmark case, the company faced massive civil liability. The Pinto scandal fundamentally transformed product liability law and corporate ethics, establishing that companies have responsibilities beyond mere compliance with minimum standards. More significantly, it introduced the concept of punitive damages, a conscious disregard of safety, creating a powerful deterrent against similar corporate calculations. Upon reflection, what makes this case particularly significant is how thoroughly it exposed the cold mathematics sometimes behind corporate safety decisions, forever changing both legal standards and public expectations for automobile manufacturer accountability. 99. Richardson Merrill gambled with children's lives in its rush to market thalidomide in America. In the early 1960s, this pharmaceutical company aggressively sought FDA approval of the sedative already popular in Europe, despite mounting evidence linking it to severe birth defects when taken by pregnant women. Richardson Merrill deliberately concealed unfavorable safety data, pressured researchers to alter findings, and distributed 2.5 million thalidomide tablets to doctors for investigational use before approval, far exceeding legitimate research requirements. The company's application was stopped primarily due to FDA physician Francis Kelsey's stubborn insistence on additional safety data. While Richardson Merrill eventually withdrew its application, its actions caused dozens of preventable birth defects in American children born to mothers who received investigational tablets. The scandal fundamentally transformed pharmaceutical regulation, directly influencing the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments, requiring rigorous proof of both safety and efficacy before drug approval. Examining this watershed moment in medical history reveals its profound significance. It demonstrated the potentially catastrophic consequences of inadequate pharmaceutical regulation, creating the modern framework for drug approval that continues to protect patients worldwide from similar preventable tragedies. 100. Nestlé transformed infant formula marketing into a public health catastrophe that still reverberates today. Throughout the 1970s, the food giant aggressively promoted formula feeding in developing nations through tactics including hiring milk nurses, saleswomen in nurse uniforms, providing free hospital samples that lasted just long enough for mothers' natural milk to dry up, and advertising suggesting formula was more modern and Western than breastfeeding. These practices proved lethal in regions lacking clean water, refrigeration, and literacy skills needed for safe formula preparation. Diluted formula and contaminated water caused epidemics of malnutrition and diarrheal disease, with mortality rates skyrocketing among formula-fed infants. When confronted with mounting evidence, Nestlé initially denied responsibility, claiming parents were misusing their product. The resulting international boycott finally forced fundamental changes in marketing practices. The scandal directly led to the World Health Organization's International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, which continues to govern infant formula marketing globally. Analyzing this corporate ethics case reveals how thoroughly it transformed expectations for multinational corporate responsibility, establishing that companies must consider the real-world contexts in which their products will be used, particularly when marketing to vulnerable populations. 101. And for our final corporate catastrophe, Union Carbide transformed the chemical industry through a disaster that remains unmatched in industrial history. In December 1984, a pesticide plant in Bhopal, India, released over 40 tons of deadly methyl isocyanate gas into surrounding neighborhoods during the night. The immediate death toll exceeded 3,000, while estimates of eventual deaths range from 15,000 to 20,000, with hundreds of thousands suffering permanent injuries, including blindness and lung damage. Investigations revealed that virtually all safety systems had been inoperative, maintenance severely neglected, and staff training inadequate. Most critically, the company had systematically reduced safety standards at the Indian plant compared to identical facilities in the U.S. Union Carbide eventually paid $470 million in compensation, approximately $370 per victim. Catastrophe fundamentally transformed chemical industry regulation worldwide, leading directly to the U.S. Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, requiring disclosure of hazardous chemicals to surrounding communities. The disaster established the principle that multinational corporations have responsibilities to maintain consistent safety standards globally rather than exploiting regulatory differences between countries. When examining this pivotal industrial disaster analytically, one cannot escape its profound historical significance. It demonstrated the potentially apocalyptic consequences when corporate cost-cutting intersects with inadequate regulatory oversight, forever altering our understanding of corporate environmental responsibility. So that wraps up our journey through the shadiest chapters of business history. From the early speculators of the tulip mania to the modern tech deception at Theranos, these scandals prove that corporate greed finds new ways to manifest in every era. But now it's your turn. What do you think? Are these corporate catastrophes just isolated bad actors or symptoms of a system that rewards shortcuts and deception? Maybe Enron's spectacular fall or Madoff's decades-long Ponzi scheme changed your perspective on financial oversight. Did we miss any business scandals that shocked you even more? Tell us your pick for the most outrageous corporate fraud in the comments. The best responses get pinned. If you enjoyed this deep dive into corporate corruption, prove it. Hit subscribe and ring the bell for our upcoming expose on financial regulations that failed.